Millions of people are going to walk out of their front doors today, look up at a beautiful blue sky, and just make a terrible, freezing mistake.
Oh, absolutely. It's inevitable.
Right. Like they are going to leave their coats behind, step out into the wind, and instantly regret every life choice that led them to that moment.
The classic light jacket trap.
Yes. And the craziest part about this is, well, they made the exact same mistake yesterday, and they will probably make it again tomorrow.
It's like a mass delusion.
It really is. It's this synchronized biological glitch that sweeps across the hemisphere every single year. But before we get to why you are currently freezing in a light jacket, I want you to think about how you woke up this morning. Because there's a very good chance that at some point this week you woke up and you were actually awake.
Like genuinely awake.
Exactly. Not just doing that, that zombie shuffle from the bed to the kitchen, waiting for your morning coffee to kick in and give you the illusion of being alive. You opened your eyes and your brain was simply on.
It's a jarring feeling when it first happens.
It really is. So if any of this sounds vaguely familiar, if you've been, a little suspicious of your own sudden burst of energy recently, welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us.
It is incredibly exciting to be here, diving into a phenomenon that touches every single person listening.
Yeah.
I mean, it completely alters our behavior, our mood, and even like our visual perception, often without us consciously realizing it's happening.
So let's set the stage a bit. The material we are analyzing today comes from a really fascinating place. It originally started its life framed as an advanced English language discussion.
Right, a C2 level listening practice.
Yeah, exactly. Focused on the vocabulary of the changing seasons. It was meant to be, just a simple exercise in learning idioms and adjectives about weather and moods.
And on the surface, that sounds like a very straightforward, almost academic linguistic exercise, right? Mm-hmm. You learn the precise vocabulary to describe rain patterns. You memorize the adjectives to describe the changing foliage.
Yeah.
But when you look closer at the transcript of this discussion, you realize it is operating on a completely different level. It's actually this deeply profound psychological and biological exploration, completely disguised as a vocabulary lesson.
Completely disguised. And that brings us to our mission statement for today. Because we aren't here to just read a dictionary to you or give you a vocabulary quiz. We are going to use this material to completely decode the human experience of spring.
Which is so much more complex than just flowers blooming.
So much more. We are going to explore the underlying mechanics, the how and the why of how shifting seasons quite literally rewrite our neurochemistry. We're going to examine how the environment tricks our sensory processing.
And it does trick us constantly.
And how it compels us almost against our will to reorganize our physical living spaces. And ultimately, why this specific time of year offers a vastly superior biologically supported opportunity for a genuine fresh start compared to, the arbitrary date of January 1st.
It is a profound realization when you see the underlying logic. It reveals how deeply intertwined our internal emotional states and our very capacity for ambition are tethered to external environmental realities.
Yeah.
We like to think we're in complete control of our moods and our productivity, but this material forces us to confront how much of our daily operating system is just being dictated by the angle of the sun.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning with that internal experience, because the material points out something fundamental. This sudden, almost suspicious shift in human energy happens internally before we ever consciously register that the season has changed on the calendar.
The phrase that comes to mind is a biological switch. It really does feel like a heavy industrial switch just violently flipping from off to on somewhere deep inside our nervous system.
And the distinction the material makes is brilliant. It talks about the difference between being fake awake and actually awake. Because during the winter, we are essentially experts at being fake awake.
But we've perfected.
You know the routine, the alarm goes off in the pitch black, you drag yourself out of bed, you're moving, you're technically breathing, you might even be responding to emails.
Barely.
Right, barely. But your brain is utterly reliant on external stimulants just to reach a baseline level of human function.
What is happening there mechanically is sleep inertia, compounded by a massive lack of light. In the winter, when your alarm goes off in the dark, your body is still heavily producing melatonin.
That's the hormone that regulates sleep, right?
Exactly. So your suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is this tiny region in your brain that acts as your master clock, it looks at the dark room and says, "It is night. Go back to sleep."
Wow.
So when you are fake awake, You are quite literally fighting your own biochemistry. You are trying to operate a machine that is desperately trying to power itself down.
But then that switch flips. The material describes waking up on like a random Tuesday and that crushing weight is just gone. And the really wild part, the part that makes you feel almost suspicious of yourself, is that the shift happens when absolutely nothing else in your life has changed.
This is the critical variable to isolate. If we want to understand human behavior, we have to look at what changed. In this scenario, you have the exact same job.
Yes.
You're living in the exact same apartment. You're dealing with the exact same commute, the same daily stresses, the same interpersonal dramas. Your daily routine is a perfect carbon copy of what it was a week ago.
Right.
Yet, the internal subjective experience of executing that routine is suddenly effortless.
Effortless is the perfect word for it. The material notes this specific phenomenon of having the urge to move without any internal negotiation, like going for a walk after work. In January, getting yourself to exercise or go for a walk requires a massive motivational speech.
A full inner monologue.
Yes, you have to guilt yourself, you have to bargain with yourself, you promise yourself a treat afterward, but suddenly you just finish work and you walk outside. You don't even think about it. And the catalyst for this, it's not a promotion, it's not a lottery win. It is simply the sun staying out a fraction longer.
We really have to give the sun its due credit here. This material captures a reality we often overlook in our modern indoor lives, which is that light dictates our sense of possibility.
How so?
Let's break down the mechanics. In the dead of winter, when you finish your workday at 5 o'clock and it is already pitch black outside, the psychological and biological messaging is unequivocal. It says, the day is over, retreat, conserve energy, survive.
Surviving until bedtime.
Yes, as the text aptly puts it, surviving until bedtime. But when you log off work and there's still bright light hitting your retinas, that light travels straight to that master clock in your brain, suppressing the melatonin and likely triggering a release of serotonin.
Which is the neurotransmitter associated with mood and energy.
Precisely. So the psychological messaging shifts instantly from survive to I could still do something.
That shift from surviving until bedtime to I could still do something, I mean, that is a monumental leap in human consciousness. It's the transition from being a passive victim of your evening to an active architect of it.
It really is. And the material uses a very evocative word here. It says, we certainly feel lighter. If we look at the evolutionary context, the dark, cold winter literally makes us feel physically heavy, because our bodies are in conservation mode.
Like we're hoarding resources.
Exactly. We are hoarding calories. We are minimizing unnecessary movement to preserve heat. We are weighed down by the sheer invisible biological effort of staying warm and functioning in the dark. So when spring arrives, it literally lifts a metabolic weight we didn't fully realize we were carrying. We're shedding an environmental burden.
I always think of it like a video game. Have you ever played one of those massive open-world role-playing games where your character has to trudge through like a toxic swamp or a massive blizzard?
Oh yeah, where everything is incredibly slow.
Right. While you are in that zone, your stamina bar is constantly draining. It's glowing red, your character is moving at half speed, and every single action takes twice as much effort. You are just grinding it out, and then suddenly you cross an invisible threshold on the map. You step out of the blizzard and into a sunny green meadow. Instantly, your character gets a massive random stamina boost. Your movement speed doubles. The heavy breathing audio stops. You have full energy.
That is a phenomenal mechanical analogy for the human experience of this transition.
Yeah.
You are suddenly operating on a completely different fuel source.
But the funny thing is, when this happens to us in real life, we are deeply suspicious of our own capability. It feels completely unearned. You catch yourself cleaning the kitchen baseboards at 6:30 p.m. and you think, wait, who am I right now? Am I having a manic episode?
Right, because winter has so thoroughly conditioned us to expect exhaustion as our default state.
We don't trust the energy.
No, because in our modern logical framework, energy is a transaction. We think we have to earn it by getting 9 hours of sleep, or we have to buy it by drinking a massive iced coffee. We aren't used to energy just being freely given to us by the geometry of the solar system.
But let me push back on this a bit, because I think there is a cynical explanation we have to consider. Is it possible we are giving the sun and our biology a little too much credit here?
How do you mean?
Well, we're highly socialized creatures, right? We are all deeply plugged into the cultural matrix. We all have digital calendars. We see the coffee shops rolling out their spring-themed cups. Could the sudden burst of energy just be a massive collective placebo effect? Like, we see the calendar flip from February to March, and we subconsciously tell ourselves, okay, society says it's time to be happy and energetic now, so we just act it out.
It is a brilliant question, and it gets to the heart of the debate between psychological conditioning and biological determinism. But the material we are analyzing makes a very firm stance that this is fundamentally environmental and biological. It's not merely a placebo effect of the calendar.
But how do we know for sure?
The proof lies in the physical, visceral validation of the sunlight itself.
How does that validate it, though? I mean, a placebo can feel very physical.
True, but a calendar date cannot physically synthesize vitamin D in your skin. A date on a screen cannot hit the photoreceptors in the back of your eye with enough lux intensity to halt the production of sleep hormones. The material points out that it's the physical act of stepping outside, finishing work while the sun is still high enough to cast a shadow, that triggers the change.
So it's about the literal light.
Exactly. If it were just the calendar, you would feel exactly the same whether you were locked in a windowless basement on March 20th or standing in a park. But you don't. The environmental reality is the switch. The calendar is just a label we put on the switch.
Okay, I concede the point. It's not the concept of spring. It is the physical manifestation of photons hitting our eyeballs. And the material actually highlights the exact cultural term we have invented to describe this biological override, spring fever.
It is a remarkable piece of vocabulary. Spring fever.
It really is, because it sounds terrible. It sounds like a Victorian illness. It sounds like something you need to be quarantined for. Oh no, I can't come to work today. I've caught the spring fever. Fetch the leeches.
Yeah, it's a misnomer in terms of pathology, but highly accurate in terms of symptomatology. The text clarifies that this is an entirely positive affliction. It's a restless excitement.
Right.
Because a fever is characterized by an elevated internal state, right? Your body temperature rises. In spring fever, your psychological baseline rises. It's the feeling of wanting to do absolutely everything all at once. The fever is an overwhelming abundance of ambition that your nervous system hasn't quite figured out how to regulate yet.
And the way this manifests in our actual behavior is hilariously predictable and overly ambitious. The material talks about this specific symptom, making massively long lists of plans.
Oh, the list.
Yes. You sit down with your sudden video game stamina boost, you grab a notebook, and you write down every single thing you are going to accomplish. You are going to paint the entire living room. You're going to start a complex vegetable garden from seeds. You are going to read a dense classic novel every week, and you are going to start training for a half marathon.
The ambition is completely unmoored from the reality of space and time. It is a hyper-dopaminergic state. Dopamine is the molecule of anticipation and reward. Spring triggers this massive release, and your brain just starts writing checks that your actual schedule cannot possibly cash.
Exactly. Because as the material rightly jokes, you make this incredibly dense, beautiful list of plans in April, and then by June you look back at it and you have accomplished maybe 2 of those things.
If you're lucky.
Right. But the crucial takeaway here is that the physical feeling, the desperate burning desire to make the list is so overpowering.
It is the optimism of the season overriding your rational executive functioning. The fever part of spring fever is that temporary, beautiful delusion that you suddenly possess infinite time and infinite energy. And here's why that matters. Even if you only accomplish 2 tiny things on a lot of 50, the sheer act of conceptualizing the list is a profound evolutionary victory over the winter mindset.
Because in winter, you aren't making lists like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In January, your only list was acquire calories, generate heat, do not die.
Yeah.
In spring, your list is expansive.
It's the shift from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. It's the difference between merely surviving and actively aspiring.
Exactly.
So we have thoroughly established this massive internal shift, this deep biological switch that flips inside our brains, flooding us with serotonin and dopamine, giving us spring fever, and turning us into highly ambitious beings who are slightly suspicious of our own sudden capability. But this internal feeling doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is intrinsically linked to and mirrored by an aggressively sudden external transformation in the physical environment around us. So we're shifting the focus now from how we feel inside to what our eyes are suddenly telling us about the outside world.
And aggressive is entirely the correct word to describe this environmental shift. When you step back and observe it objectively, the speed of nature's transformation during this window is genuinely shocking.
The material captures the visceral nature of this so perfectly. It talks about the life cycle of the trees in our immediate surroundings, because for months they are completely empty. They're just barren, skeletal brown sticks scratching against a flat gray sky. They look dead.
Completely dormant.
And then in what feels like a single compressed week, they were completely full. You stop paying attention to the street outside your house for maybe 3 or 4 days, and then you look out the window and think, wait, where did all of that volume come from?
It is a literal explosion of biomass, and the material provides us with a very specific, evocative term to decode this new visual reality, lush.
Lush. It is a great word. It almost sounds like what it describes.
It does. But the way the text defines it goes beyond a simple dictionary entry for greenery. It describes vegetation that is thick, rich, and deeply green. But it specifies that it's not just a normal, everyday green. The material says it looks almost too green, like someone painted it.
That is exactly the phenomenon. It looks entirely artificial. It's so bright and saturated that it almost looks toxic. It feels like reality has been replaced by a high-budget movie set where the production designer went completely overboard with the green spray paint.
Let's look at the underlying mechanics of why we perceive it as too green. This isn't just an aesthetic observation. It is rooted in evolutionary biology and human vision.
Oh, really?
Yes. Humans and certain other primates evolved trichromatic vision, meaning we have 3 types of cone cells in our eyes. This was an evolutionary adaptation specifically designed to allow us to pick out the contrast between bright colors and green leaves.
So we're literally built to see this specific change.
Exactly. When we see that sudden, overwhelming burst of lush green, our visual cortex goes into overdrive. For hundreds of thousands of years, that specific shade of aggressive, saturated green signaled one crucial thing to our ancestors' survival. It meant water is present, edible plants are growing, and game animals will return. So when we look at it today, even if we are just looking at a manicured suburban lawn, our deep brain registers it as profound safety and abundance.
That explains why it hits us so hard emotionally. And it isn't just the green, is it? It's the sudden appearance of the accent colors, the explosion of pinks, yellows, and the stark whites of the blossoms breaking through the canopy. The material uses another fantastic anchor word here, vibrant, meaning bright, colorful, and bursting with energy.
And again, if we apply the evolutionary lens, vibrant colors against a lush green background signal, ripe fruit, nectar, or medicinal flowers. Our brains are hardwired to release a tiny hit of reward chemicals when we spot these high contrast colors. What is fascinating here is how the source material explicitly connects these raw visual stimuli to our complex emotional states.
Right.
It argues that being surrounded by these lush, vibrant colors is not just aesthetically pleasing in a passive way, like admiring a nice piece of art in a museum lobby. It describes the visual experience as actively uplifting.
We really need to pause on that distinction because uplifting is an active verb. It means the environment is reaching into your brain and tangibly forcing you to be happier and more energetic. The material emphasizes that the concept of nature improving your mood is not some poetic, romantic exaggeration invented by poets.
No, not at all.
It is a literal physiological response mechanism. Being completely immersed in a vibrant visual environment elevates your heart rate in a positive way, lowers your cortisol, and changes your state of being. It makes me think about how we interact with technology and digital images. Think about taking a photo on your smartphone on a cloudy, depressing, flat Tuesday in mid-February. The photo looks dull. It looks lifeless. So what is the very first thing you do before you post it or send it to anyone?
You edit it.
Right. You go into the photo editing app, you find the little slider labeled saturation, and you just drag that thing all the way to the right. Suddenly, the dull gray sky becomes a piercing artificial blue. The dead brown grass becomes neon green. The sudden aggressive change in nature during spring is like someone taking the saturation slider for the entire physical world and cranking it up to 100 in the span of 72 hours.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. You are describing the exact process of color rendering, but happening in real-time biology. And the material delves deeper into this idea by making a profound observation. It says that the vibrant colors make it feel like the color itself is alive. When the physical environment around us wakes up and cranks its own saturation to 100, it creates a massive, inescapable feedback loop with our internal spring fever.
A feedback loop. Okay, let's explore the mechanics of that loop. How does the outside world talking to our inside world create a loop?
Let's trace the steps. Step 1, you have that internal biological switch flip, the spring fever we analyzed earlier. Your SCN suppresses melatonin, serotonin spikes, and you feel a sudden surge of internal energy.
Right, the video game stamina boost.
Exactly. But imagine for a moment if that happened, but the environment didn't change. Imagine you felt that massive rush of ambition and energy, but you walked outside and the world was still frozen, dead, gray, and barren. That internal energy would feel profoundly incongruous.
Well, it'd be weird.
It would feel misplaced, almost manic. You would feel a desperate need to act, but you would have nowhere to direct that action and absolutely zero environmental validation for your physiological state.
It would be incredibly confusing. It would be cognitive dissonance. Going back to my video game analogy, it would be like getting the massive stamina boost, but you are still trapped in the slow-moving, toxic swamp level. Your character is vibrating with energy, but there is nowhere safe to run.
Precisely. The internal state would clash violently with the external reality. But because the external world is simultaneously becoming lush and vibrant, the environment serves as an external validator for your internal state.
So they reinforce each other.
Yes, your internal neurochemistry says go, and the vibrant, high-saturation world around you says, yes, absolutely go. Look at all this life. You are entirely correct to feel this energetic. The external aliveness feeds the internal aliveness, which in turn makes you more perceptive to the external beauty. It's a perfect self-sustaining loop of biological momentum.
I want to ask you, the listener, to run an experiment today. Think about your own neighborhood right now. Think about your daily commute to work or your standard walking route to the grocery store. Does it ever feel to you like the leaves literally popped out overnight when you weren't looking?
It always feels like that.
Yeah.
Like you walked past a specific oak tree on a Monday and it was just dead wood. And then you walked past the exact same tree on a Wednesday and it's a massive, lush, impenetrable green canopy. And you feel like you somehow entirely missed the biological process in between.
It's the great sneak attack of the seasons. Human perception is incredibly faulty when it comes to slow, incremental changes. We never seem to catch nature in the act of changing. Our brains only alert us when the finished product is suddenly overwhelming.
It's a brilliant sneak attack. But here is where we have to introduce a little bit of tension into this narrative. Because as beautiful and vibrant and lush as all of this is, as powerful as this feedback loop is, it is not all perfect. Because just when you think you are safe in this bright, colorful, high-saturation new world, just when you have fully bought into the spring fever and surrendered to the momentum spring, pulls a fast one on you.
It absolutely does. And this is where the material brilliantly pivots from the visual majesty of the season to the harsh, unforgiving physical reality of the weather itself. It introduces the friction. The material uses a very specific word for spring weather, and I think it is the single most accurate adjective I have ever heard applied to meteorology. The word is deceiving.
Deceiving. It presents one reality to your eyes, but delivers a completely contradictory reality to your skin.
We have all lived this exact humiliating scenario. It is the classic trap of the season. You look out your window in the morning, you see the vibrant, piercing blue sky, you see the bright yellow sun shining down, casting sharp shadows. You see the lush, almost artificial green grass. Your brain, which is already heavily under the influence of the spring fever feedback loop, processes all this visual data and confidently concludes it is a beautiful, warm day.
And then you make the mistake.
You do. So you leave the house in a light denim jacket, or maybe feeling overly ambitious, you skip the jacket entirely. You step out the front door, the spring wind hits you, and you immediately realize you have made a catastrophic error.
It is a universally shared human experience. You're standing there shivering, utterly freezing, and you feel a profound sense of betrayal. You're actually angry at the sky for lying to you.
The sky is an absolute liar in spring. But here's where it gets really interesting and where we need to dig into the psychology. Why do we fall for it? Why, year after year, decade after decade, do intelligent adult human beings fall for the deception?
That's a great question.
I liken it to having a beautiful, charismatic, but deeply untrustworthy friend. You know this friend has a documented history of giving you terrible advice and leaving you stranded. But they are so charming and they look so good doing it that when they text you and say, hey, let's go out, it's going to be great, you don't need a coat, you just blindly trust them again against all your past experiences.
We fall for it because of a phenomenon known as sensory dominance, specifically visual dominance. Humans are overwhelmingly visual creatures. A massive portion of our brain's cortex is devoted solely to processing visual information. Because we have that spring fever, and because the world visually looks so intensely vibrant, Our brains automatically cross-wire that visual input with thermal expectations.
Wait, really? Our brains just assume visual equals warm.
Yes. In human experience, bright, unfiltered sunlight and lush, growing colors are inextricably linked to heat. Summer is bright and hot. Therefore, when spring is bright, our visual processing center shouts warmth so loudly that it completely overrides our logical historical memory of how bitterly cold a 40-degree spring wind actually is. Our eyes literally convince our skin that it should be warm, right up until the second we actually step outside and reality violently corrects the error.
So it's essentially a systemic override. Our eyes are hacking our common sense. But if we know it's deceiving, if we get burned, or rather frozen by this literal sensory hack every single year, why don't we adapt? Are we just hopelessly optimistic as a species, or do we never learn?
I think optimism plays a huge role, yes, but it's also a form of psychological desperation. After months of darkness, we are desperate for the warmth. We want the visual promise to be true so badly that we actively ignore the empirical evidence of the thermometer. However, what makes this source material so valuable is that it doesn't just point out the trap. It offers a highly effective psychological tool for dealing with this specific deception.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it introduces the concept of cognitive reframing regarding physical discomfort.
Reframing it how? Because I have to be honest, when I am standing at a bus stop freezing in a light jacket because the blue sky lied to me, I am just miserable. There is no positive spin on shivering.
But the material suggests there is. It brings up the vocabulary word brisk. It describes these deceptive spring mornings as brisk, which it carefully defines as cool and fresh, but specifically in a way that wakes up the body with a sharp, clean feeling.
Okay, I see.
Notice what that definition does. It acknowledges the physical reality of the cold. It doesn't pretend it's warm, but it frames it as a positive, stimulating cold. It recategorizes the temperature from a punishing, dangerous winter freeze into an energetic, biological wake-up call.
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of that reframe. Instead of stepping outside, getting hit by the wind, and having the internal monologue of, the sky lied to me, I am an idiot, I am freezing and miserable, my day is ruined, you force your brain to pivot. You step out, the wind hits you, and you tell yourself, what a brisk morning, how incredibly sharp and clean the air is. My respiratory system is fully awake now.
Exactly. It completely changes your relationship to the thermal data. You are taking the exact same physical sensation and routing it through a different emotional pathway in your brain. And the material highlights another major reframing tool, this one regarding a different kind of deceiving weather dealing with a constant, endless rain. Because we forget, spring is incredibly wet.
April showers, that is the classic cultural term for it. And let's be honest, it can be genuinely infuriating. You have the spring fever, you want to be out in the vibrant world, you want to execute your massive list of plans, but you're trapped inside because it is constantly raining for 3 days straight.
It creates immense friction. But the material points to the classic idiom, April showers bring May flowers. This is perhaps the ultimate, most deeply ingrained example of psychological reframing in our language.
How so?
Well, it could take something deeply annoying, constant wet weather ruining your plans, and forcefully connects it to a positive anticipation of the future.
It's a mechanism for delayed gratification.
Exactly. It uses teleological thinking, assigning a purpose to a natural phenomena. You aren't just passively getting rained on and having your day ruined. You're witnessing the necessary mechanical process that creates the lush greenery you're so desperate for. It gives the current physical discomfort a vital future purpose. The rain becomes an investment rather than an obstacle.
So we have navigated the complexities of the external world. We've traced the biological switch of our internal energy. We've marveled at the evolutionary triggers of the lush, vibrant environment. And we've explored the cognitive dissonance of deceiving weather, learning to reframe brisk winds and April showers. Now I want to take all of this accumulated insight and bring the conversation back indoors.
Let's do it.
Because this massive internal spring fever doesn't just change how we interact with trees and weather, it aggressively, almost violently affects the physical spaces we control.
It absolutely does. It creates a powerful, unavoidable behavioral urge to alter our immediate physical surroundings to match our newly altered internal neurochemistry.
The material describes this feeling with such pinpoint accuracy. It is that highly specific moment when you are standing in the middle of your living room or maybe sitting on the edge of your bed, and you look around at the exact same room you've lived in for months, and suddenly everything just feels wrong. The space feels too dark, it feels physically heavy, and most importantly, it feels entirely claustrophobically too full of stuff.
It is a profound, sudden sense of alienation from the environment that has perfectly served and protected you for the last 4 months.
And the behavioral urge that inevitably follows this alienation is what the material calls the urge to revamp. I love the inclusion of this word because revamp is so much stronger and more aggressive than simply saying you want to change or clean your space. You don't just want to tidy up, you want to revamp it. You want to tear it down to the studs and give it a fundamentally fresh new look and feel.
The material notes that revamping carries a deep psychological sense of renewal. Let's look at the mechanics of this from an environmental psychology perspective. It is not just about aesthetics. It is about regaining control of your environment so that it resonates with your new, elevated internal energy frequency.
Right.
Think about a winter mindset again. During the dark months, you are lethargic. You are in conservation mode. And your physical space organically comes to reflect that hibernation state. It becomes closed off, insulated, dense.
Yeah, you pull heavy curtains closed, you pile on the blankets.
Exactly. But when the spring fever hits and your internal energy spikes, that insulated space suddenly feels like a cage that needs to be broken open. The environment is creating friction with your mood. So what is the behavioral output? You physically move the heavy furniture, you buy new brightly colored cushions, you throw open every single window in the house to force the brisk outside air inside.
You're literally trying to physically invite the external spring into your internal cave. And a massive part of that revamping process involves a very specific, almost manic, universal human behavior. The absolute desperate necessity to seek out and destroy what the material refers to as odds and ends.
The odds and ends. This is where human behavior gets truly fascinating.
The material defines odds and ends as all those random, small, disparate things that you have been unconsciously collecting all winter that serve absolutely zero real purpose. We are talking about a tangled ball of random small cables, stacks of old magazines you already read, a bizarre, heavy collection of half-used AA batteries, receipts from November, things you bought online at 2 a.m. and never actually took out of the box.
It is incredibly revealing to analyze this specific behavior from an evolutionary and psychological perspective.
Yeah.
We have to ask, why do we acquire the odds and ends in the first place, and why do we suddenly hate them in April?
Yeah, what's the logic there?
Think about the nesting instinct. During the dark, cold, hostile winter, human beings have a deep subconscious instinct to gather resources, to insulate ourselves against scarcity. We collect odds and ends because having physical mass around us, even if it's useless mass, feels like a psychological buffer against the harshness outside. It's a manifestation of loss aversion and a scarcity mindset. It's a form of hoarding for survival, even if what we are hoarding is a useless, broken USB-C adapter from 3 phones ago.
It is exactly like a bear accumulating a thick layer of fat for the winter. We instinctively hoard random useless items because our ancient brain is whispering, keep this, you might need it to survive when you are trapped inside by the snow. But then spring arrives, the fever hits, the sunlight flips the switch, and we wake up, we look at this pile of junk, and we suddenly realize the absolute absurdity of saving 5 different types of legacy charging tables. The physical insulation that comforted us in December feels like literal suffocation in April.
That is precisely the mechanism.
Yeah.
When the environment signals abundance, lush, green, vibrant colors, warmth that gathered insulation is no longer required. In fact, it becomes a psychological liability. The physical act of opening the windows and violently throwing a massive black trash bag full of old magazines and tangled cables into the dumpster is a profound psychological shedding of the winter self.
It's unnesting.
It is unnesting. It is shedding the winter coat. And it works because of the connection between physical clutter and cortisol. Studies show that looking at disorganized clutter spikes our stress hormones. By clearing out the physical odds and ends, you are quite literally clearing out mental bandwidth. You are lowering your visual cortisol triggers to make room for the new dopaminergic energy of the spring.
And this brings us to the epicenter of this phenomenon, the most universally recognized, heavily guarded location for these odds and ends. The material specifically, and hilariously, calls it out the kitchen drawer where things go to disappear forever.
The doom drawer. Every single human dwelling on Earth has one.
The doom drawer. I want to break the fourth wall here and ask you, listening to this right now directly, what does your personal disappearing drawer look like at this exact moment in time? If you were to walk into your kitchen right now, put your hand on the handle and pull it open, What forensic evidence of your winter hibernation is in there?
I shudder to think.
Right. Are there takeout menus from restaurants that permanently closed in 2021? Are there 7 dead pens and 1 pencil with no eraser? Is there a single, heavy, mysterious brass key that you are terrified to throw away even though you have absolutely no idea what door on earth it opens?
Always the mysterious key.
Always. And more importantly, as we talk about this, do you feel a sudden, desperate, irrational urge to go home, dump the entire contents of that drawer onto the kitchen counter, and ruthlessly sort it? Because if you do, that is not just a desire to clean. That is your biological spring fever actively commanding you to revamp your environment.
It is the biological imperative to clear the slate.
Which perfectly transitions us to the ultimate philosophical conclusion of the material we are decoding today. We have thoroughly examined the biological switch of the fever, the evolutionary psychology of vibrant colors, the cognitive dissonance of deceiving weather, and the unnesting instinct that makes us purge our doom drawers. But we have to ask the big question: why does all of this matter? What is the larger, actionable point of understanding this massive seasonal shift?
It matters deeply because it leads to the final and most important vocabulary concept. The material introduces the feeling of being rejuvenated. Spring brings a holistic feeling of being completely renewed, a hard reset accompanied by fresh, sustainable energy. And the material uses this concept to launch a profound critique of how our modern society structures the very concept of a fresh start.
The material argues something that I think is incredibly validating and honestly a huge relief to hear. It argues that January is actually a genuinely terrible time for a fresh start.
If we connect all the biological and psychological dots we've discussed today to the bigger picture, this material is fundamentally deconstructing the entire societal norm of New Year's resolution.
Absolutely.
Think about how we operate. We are culturally almost brutally conditioned to believe that January 1st is the undisputed time for New Year, New Me. We make massive lists of life-altering goals. We sign binding contracts at gyms. We vow to completely overhaul our diets, our finances, and our sleep habits all on a single day.
But the material points out the brutal, undeniable reality of January. What is January actually like? It is freezing cold. It is pitch dark by 4:30 p.m. We are biologically exhausted. The material explicitly states that January does not feel like a new beginning. January feels like a punishment.
And this is exactly why arbitrary calendar dates fail us so spectacularly. Let's look at the history and the chronobiology. January 1st, as the start of the year, is an entirely human invention. It was established by the Romans, largely for political and civic reasons, not biological ones. It is just a number on a piece of paper.
Right.
But your biology does not read the Gregorian calendar. When you try to force a massive systemic lifestyle change in the dead of winter, you are fighting a war on 2 fronts. You are fighting against your own internal biology, which is pumping you full of melatonin and begging you to hibernate, and you are fighting against your external environment, which is cold, dark, and hostile. You are trying to act vibrant and lush, while the entire physical world outside your window is frozen and dead. It is a recipe for massive ego depletion.
It's like trying to swim upstream in a freezing, rushing river. You might make a little bit of progress for the first few yards through sheer, agonizing, white-knuckled willpower. But eventually, the current of your environment and the freezing cold of your biology are going to exhaust your muscles and wash you right back to exactly where you started.
Yes.
Which is exactly why the statistical reality is that most New Year's resolutions are completely abandoned by the second week of February. We just run out of willpower.
But the material argues that spring is a vastly superior time for real, lasting behavioral changes. Why? Because of one profound phrase the text uses: nature agrees with you.
Nature agrees with you. I want to put that on a billboard. That is such a powerful, paradigm-shifting phrase. It's not just a date on a calendar anymore. The world actually looks different to your visual cortex. The world actually feels different to your nervous system.
Let's look at the mechanics of making a change in the spring. When you decide to start a new habit or revamp your life or tackle a massive project in April, you are no longer swimming against the current. You are actively riding a massive, naturally occurring wave of biological momentum.
Yeah.
Your internal biological switch has flipped, suppressing melatonin and flooding you with dopamine and spring fever energy. And simultaneously, the external environment is vibrant, lush, and visually uplifting, validating and reinforcing that internal energy loop. In January, as the material profoundly notes, you are aggressively forcing yourself to change. In spring, your neurochemistry makes you actively want to change.
Making a resolution in spring is like having a jetpack strapped to your back. The entire environment is actively conspiring to propel you forward.
It really makes you wonder about the macro implications. How much might our lives, our productivity, and our collective societal mental health improve if we just collectively agreed to officially move our cultural new year away from January 1st and aligned it with the vernal equinox? What if we aligned our societal goal setting, our fiscal years, our educational milestones, with the season of actual biological rejuvenation rather than the season of physical and psychological punishment?
Okay, let's play devil's advocate here. So what does this all mean for discipline? Let me push back on this a little bit because I think there is a strong philosophical counter-argument to be made, perhaps from a Stoic perspective.
Let's hear it.
Isn't there inherent vital value in the discipline of January? If we only ever make changes or start difficult new things when the weather is nice, when the birds are singing, and when we have the biological jetpack of spring fever doing all the heavy lifting, aren't we just taking the easy way out? Doesn't true, resilient human growth require the friction of pushing through the dark and the cold? If you can go to the gym at 5 a.m. in a blizzard in January, you have built ironclad character. If you only go when the sun is shining, are you actually building discipline, or are you just coasting on good weather?
That is an incredibly valid, very robust philosophical point.
Yeah.
The Stoic argument for discipline through adversity is a cornerstone of human philosophy. And yes, discipline, the ability to execute a task regardless of internal motivation or external conditions, is a vital human skill. But I would counter that relying solely exclusively on raw discipline in a biologically and environmentally hostile setting is a statistical recipe for catastrophic burnout.
How so?
Because willpower is a finite, depletable resource. Behavioral psychology demonstrates this repeatedly. Forcing massive discipline in the dark, when your body is biologically commanding you to conserve energy, requires burning an unsustainable amount of cognitive fuel. It is simply less efficient and less sustainable than harnessing genuine, biologically generated inspiration in the light.
I see.
Spring offers us a very specific, scientifically backed window of genuine, frictionless desire to change. Why would we ignore that advantage? Why not capitalize on the precise time of year when your body and the environment are naturally aligned to support the heavy lifting of behavioral change? It is not taking the easy way out. It is acting with strategic intelligence. It is choosing to work in harmony with human nature rather than constantly, exhaustingly battling against it just to prove a point about suffering.
You know, when you frame it like that as strategic intelligence rather than weakness, it makes complete sense. Why make the hardest things in life even harder by fighting the solar system at the same time? Use the jetpack when it's offered.
Exactly. Wisdom is knowing when to use discipline and when to ride the momentum.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible journey today. We started by examining that strange, jarring physiological switch of waking up actually awake, decoding the neuroscience of melatonin, serotonin, and the onset of spring fever. We then moved outside to witness the shocking speed of nature's transition, exploring how our evolutionary biology causes lush greens and vibrant colors to literally alter our heart rates and uplift our moods.
We learned how to navigate the cognitive dissonance of deceiving weather, understanding why our visual dominance makes us fall for the light jacket trap, and how to linguistically reframe brisk winds and April showers to our psychological advantage.
We brought that frantic energy back indoors, analyzing the deep evolutionary unnesting urge to revamp our living spaces and violently purge our doom drawers of all those winter odds and ends. And finally, we arrived at the profound paradigm-shifting realization that spring, supported by both environment and biology, is the truest, most effective new beginning we have as human beings.
It fundamentally reframes how we should view our relationship with the passing of the seasons. We are not separate from the environment. We are a deeply integrated part of it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with the core actionable question that this material poses. Think about your own life. Think about your habits. What is the very first thing you do when spring arrives? What is your personal, undeniable indicator that the biological switch has flipped?
Is it opening a window?
Right. Do you immediately walk outside without a destination? Do you throw open all the windows in your house to let the brisk air in? Do you sit down at your kitchen table and enthusiastically write out a massively ambitious, slightly delusional list of plans? Whatever that action is, pay close attention to that urge. Do not ignore it. That is your biology waking up and offering you momentum.
And I want to leave you with one final Slightly provocative thought to mull over, branching off everything we've unpacked today.
Oh, I'm ready.
We like to think of ourselves as highly rational, autonomous individuals with fixed personalities and ironclad free will. But if our motivation to achieve our deepest goals, our desire to clean our homes, our capacity for ambition, and our baseline level of daily happiness are all so easily, drastically, and predictably dictated by the sun staying out just an hour longer and the grass turning a slightly more lush shade of green,
How much of our personality is actually us, and how much of it is just the weather? Are we really the masters of our own destiny, or are we essentially just very complex houseplants with complicated emotions?
wow. That is a thought that will absolutely stick with you the next time you look in the mirror on a beautifully bright, deceptively cold, sunny day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, trust that sudden burst of biological energy, use the jetpack of spring momentum while you have it, and whatever you do, try your absolute hardest not to fall for the trap of a light jacket tomorrow morning. We'll catch you next time. You usually experience it on a weekend. Maybe it's a Saturday morning, you're walking through your living room holding a cup of coffee, and you're just, completely absorbed in your own thoughts.
Right, just a normal morning.
Exactly. And then you stop. You look at a specific bookshelf, like a shelf you have walked past, literally 100 times over the last 6 months, a perfectly normal piece of furniture. And suddenly, the cognitive load of looking at it it just breaks you.
Yeah, it's too much.
Right. And it's not just that it looks a bit messy, it's this sudden, profound realization that the arrangement of those books, the random papers stacked on top, the dust gathering on the edges, all of it is just fundamentally intolerable.
It is a fascinating psychological pivot because, the physical object hasn't changed. The shelf hasn't, shifted overnight.
Right.
What has completely altered is your brain's tolerance for the visual noise it creates. I mean, we tend to view ourselves as highly rational operators.
Oh, absolutely. We think we're in control.
Yeah, largely immune to the subtle shifts in our physical environment. But then the barometric pressure changes, the daylight hours extend, and suddenly we are overwhelmed by this primal, almost aggressive biological mandate to completely deconstruct and overhaul our living spaces.
And that biological mandate is exactly what we are exploring today on this deep dive. We are looking at the psychological map of how the environmental transition from winter to spring forces a shift in human behavior.
Starting with our physical spaces.
Yes, starting there and ultimately rewriting our internal habits. And the lens we are using to examine this is actually, it's quite unexpected. We're dissecting a conversation from an English language learning show called Podzone.
Hosted by Emma and John.
Right, Emma and John.
Which is what makes this source material so compelling to analyze, actually, because ostensibly, Emma and John are just delivering a standard vocabulary lesson.
Yeah, they're just teaching idioms.
Exactly. They are walking their listeners through common English idioms associated with the season. But if you strip away the educational framing and just look purely at the progression of the concepts they discuss.
It's wild.
It is. They inadvertently outline a highly sophisticated behavioral model. They chart a very specific journey that moves from the physical stagnation and cognitive fatigue of winter straight into the behavioral rebirth of spring.
Right, and they actually seed this premise perfectly right at the beginning. Emma mentions early on that she wants to pivot away from discussing the passive feelings of spring fever.
Because we all know that feeling, right?
The restlessness. Everyone knows that. But Emma insists on focusing entirely on the actions that the season provokes. She pushes the conversation away from internal mood shifts and directly into external transformative behaviors.
Which is a crucial distinction in behavioral psychology. I mean, moods are atmospheric, right? But actions are mechanical. You can feel restless for months without changing your environment.
Right, just sitting on the couch feeling antsy.
Exactly. But the moment that restlessness translates into physical intervention, you cross a threshold. And the journey they map out begins at the most logical starting point for any behavioral intervention.
Ground zero.
Ground zero of our daily existence, the stagnant interior of the home.
Which brings us to Emma's weekend. So John asks her how she's dealing with her seasonal restlessness, and Emma describes spending her entire Saturday locked in what she calls an epic battle.
An epic battle. I love that phrasing.
Against her own closets. She was confronting 5 years' worth of accumulated forgotten clothing.
And the phrasing there, an epic battle against 5 years of forgotten items, is just rich with psychological implication. I mean, think about what winter requires of us. Winter is fundamentally a season of accumulation, right? And conservation.
Oh, totally. We hibernate.
We retreat indoors, we gather resources, we insulate, we build up layers, both literally in terms of clothing and figuratively in terms of our environment. So over a period of 5 years, that natural tendency to accumulate creates a massive physical burden. Emma's response to the changing season isn't to merely organize that burden, it's to wage war on the accumulation itself.
And that leads into a really sharp distinction the two of them make. John brings up the concept of decluttering, and Emma immediately draws a hard boundary between decluttering and just tidying up.
They are not the same thing.
Not at all. She defines tidying as simply putting things back where they belong. But decluttering is the act of getting rid of things that don't belong in the space at all. Like, I always compare it to a crumbling wall.
Okay, how so?
Well, tidying is just putting a fresh coat of paint on a crumbling wall. It looks better for a second. But decluttering, as Emma defines it, is structural surgery. You are tearing the wall down.
That's a great analogy, which highlights the difference between symptom management and systemic change. I mean, tidying is essentially an aesthetic illusion. It lowers the immediate visual noise, but it doesn't reduce the actual mass of the objects you own.
You're just rearranging the deck chairs.
Exactly. Decluttering is a structural intervention. You are challenging the underlying framework of the environment.
I look at it in terms of cognitive anchors. When you are just tidying, you are still mentally managing every single object.
Oh, absolutely. The mental tax.
Yes.
Yeah.
You still have to remember where the winter boots go, where the old tax documents are stored, where the broken blender is hiding. You are paying a subconscious mental tax on every item in your house, whether you're actively looking at it or not.
Right.
By removing the object entirely, you aren't just clearing a shelf. You are severing that cognitive anchor. You are literally freeing up bandwidth in your brain.
And that is precisely why Emma frames it as a battle, because breaking those cognitive anchors requires navigating a tremendous amount of psychological friction. The source material actually details the specific mechanisms she uses to force this process.
The two questions.
Yes. Emma states that during this purge, you have to look at an object and ask yourself two specific questions. Do I need this? And do I love this?
Which escalates a basic household chore into a full-blown existential interrogation.
It really does.
You are no longer just sorting laundry. You are demanding that inanimate objects justify their continued existence in your life.
It forces a binary decision matrix on a process that is usually just bogged down by sentimentality and inertia. I mean, think about the gravity of those two parameters. Do I need this? That targets sheer utility and survival.
Right, like a hammer.
Right? And I love this. That targets emotional resonance and joy. So if an object, say, a sweater you haven't worn since 2021, if it cannot satisfy either the criteria of absolute necessity or profound emotional value, Emma dictates that it has to be removed.
But wait, let me push back on that a little bit, because those two questions actually seem like a trap to me.
A trap? How do you mean?
Well, when I look at a box of old cables, my brain instantly tries to negotiate with the needs question.
Oh, the classic cable box.
Yes, everyone has one. I might not need a VGA monitor cable right now, but what if I need it in 3 years?
Right.
The brain is incredibly adept at inventing future utility just to avoid the pain of making a final decision in the present.
And that is exactly the friction that makes decluttering an epic battle. You are fighting your brain's evolutionary bias toward resource hoarding. Our cognitive architecture was not built for a world of infinite, cheap material goods.
It was built for scarcity.
Precisely. Throwing away a perfectly good tool, even an obsolete one like a VGA cable, it triggers a subtle alarm bell in the primal brain. It feels like a risk. So to overcome that risk, you have to actively override your own instincts, which burns a massive amount of mental energy.
So the exhaustion you feel after cleaning out a closet isn't physical. I mean, folding shirts isn't hard.
No, not at all.
It's decision fatigue.
Yeah.
You just make 300 consecutive micro decisions against your own evolutionary programming.
Exactly. You are actively curating the environment to reflect who you are in the present season rather than preserving the artifacts of who you were over the past 5 years.
Wow.
And once that massive structural purge is complete, the transcript points to a fascinating secondary phenomenon. Once the macro-level clutter is removed, your visual perception of the space changes entirely.
Right, the hidden stuff.
Yeah, revealing the micro-level issues you previously couldn't see.
Which brings us to the next concept Emma introduces, the deep clean. So John's immediate reaction to the phrase is to say it sounds serious. And Emma confirms that it's not just a casual wipe down of the kitchen counters.
It's much more intense.
Yeah, she defines it as actively scrubbing the spaces that are ignored for the vast majority of the year. And the three examples they use are behind the sofa, inside the oven, and on top of the cupboards.
Let's analyze the geography of those specific examples, actually. Behind the sofa, inside the oven, on top of the cupboards, these are areas that exist entirely in our peripheral vision, or they're shielded by a physical barrier.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. We sit on the sofa daily, but we deliberately ignore the negative space behind it. We use the oven, but we mentally compartmentalize the baked-on grease behind that heavy glass door.
It's selective blindness. I mean, think about your own kitchen right now. And I mean you, the listener. When was the last time you pulled over a stool, climbed up, and actually inspected the surface of your highest kitchen cabinets?
Probably never.
Right. You know logically that dust is settling there every single day. It's mixing with cooking oils to create this sticky film. But your brain simply edits that reality out of your daily awareness.
Because your brain has to edit it out. During the winter, when our physiological drive is geared toward conservation, we simply do not have the surplus energy to care about unseen dust. We narrow our focus to our immediate functional needs.
We're just trying to get by.
Exactly. The winter baseline requires us to tolerate a certain level of invisible grime in order to conserve our cognitive bandwidth for more pressing issues.
But wait, I have to challenge John's framing here. Because he says a deep clean is something you only do once or twice a year, usually in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
But from a purely logical standpoint, isn't that just culturally sanctioned procrastination?
That's an interesting way to put it.
I mean, why do we psychologically wait for the changing of the seasons to clean the grease out of the oven when we could have just as easily done it on a random Tuesday in November?
It looks like procrastination on the surface, yes, but it's actually a matter of environmental triggering. Human behavior is rarely driven by pure logic. It is driven by environmental cues and the availability of energy.
Okay, so the energy levels dictate the action.
Right. In November, your environment is signaling retreat. The days are getting shorter, the temperature is dropping, and your biological systems are winding down. The friction required to initiate a high-energy, low-reward task like scrubbing behind a heavy sofa is simply too high.
So we just defer the maintenance.
We defer the maintenance until the environmental cues shift. Spring introduces increased daylight, which directly alters our circadian rhythms and boosts our natural energy levels. So the psychological friction required to initiate a deep, clean drops significantly.
We suddenly have a surplus of energy.
Exactly. And the selective blindness we relied on during the winter lifts, we finally have the bandwidth to confront the peripheral decay of our environment.
And doing so completely resets the baseline of the home. You aren't just cleaning. You are establishing a new foundation of order, which sets up the next phase perfectly.
Right, the transition.
Yeah, because you've fought the battle of the declutter, you've dismantled the cognitive anchors, and you've scrubbed the hidden corners of your environment. You've managed the physical space.
Mm-hmm.
But according to Emma and John, the environment isn't fully transformed until you change the actual atmosphere within it.
And this is where the transcript moves us across a critical threshold. We shift from managing solid objects to manipulating the invisible elements of the space. John introduces an idiom that bridges the newly cleaned interior with the changing external world.
A breath of fresh air.
He describes the feeling of the house after a deep clean as a breath of fresh air.
And the conversation really pauses to examine the dual nature of this concept. Emma breaks it down into its literal and figurative applications. On a literal level, she describes the physical act of throwing open a window after months of winter insulation and letting the outside breeze into the house.
Which is a highly disruptive act, if you think about it.
Disruptive.
Yes, think about the physics of the air inside a house during the winter. It is trapped.
Oh, yeah. Completely sealed in.
It is endlessly recycled through heating systems, breathed and rebreathed. It's accumulating dust particles, cooking odors, and carbon dioxide. Stale air is fundamentally a closed loop. It represents the stagnant history of the last 6 months of your life trapped in a confined space.
Wow. And when you open that window, you aren't just letting a draft in. You are breaking the closed loop.
Right.
The fresh air is immediate. It doesn't just sit in one corner of the room. It forces its way through the entire volume of the space, physically displacing the heavy recycled winter air.
Exactly. And that physical reality is what makes the figurative application of the phrase so powerful.
The metaphorical breath of fresh air.
Yes. Emma explains that we use a breath of fresh air to describe a new element that fundamentally alters a stagnant situation. And she uses a specific example of a new manager taking over a team.
Which is such a universal corporate experience. I mean, an office environment can become just as much of a closed loop as a winter house.
Oh, absolutely.
A team gets stuck in cycled routines, breathing in the same stale ideas, dealing with the same interpersonal friction for years. It just becomes this echo chamber of cognitive stagnation.
And then the new manager arrives. And just like the air from the open window, the new manager's presence doesn't just affect one specific corner of the team.
Right.
Their arrival is an invisible force that permeates the entire organizational structure. They introduce new communication styles, different expectations, novel problem-solving approaches. They displace the stale routines instantly.
And once that new dynamic is introduced, the entire atmosphere of the workplace shifts. You cannot unbreathe the fresh air.
You really can't. The baseline is permanently altered.
So the threshold has been crossed. The house is purged of the past. The hidden decay is scrubbed away. The closed loop of the winter atmosphere is broken. The interior is completely resolved.
And that prompts Emma to ask John a very important question.
What's next?
Right, what's next? Now that the indoor environment is optimized, where does the energy go?
And John's answer is the most logical next step. You physically exit the house. You go outside.
But the way they describe going outside is crucial. They don't immediately launch into high-exertion activities.
They aren't running marathons.
No, they don't start running or building things. John introduces the phrase, soaking up the sun.
Yeah, Emma defines it as simply sitting or lying outside to absorb the warmth and light. And John's personal example of this is wonderfully mundane.
He says on Saturday, he plans to do absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. He's just going to go to the park, sit there, and soak up the sun.
And that concept of doing absolutely nothing is often culturally coded as laziness or unproductivity, right? But in the context of seasonal transition, it is a deliberate and vital biological process.
This is where we need to move past the traditional metaphors, I think. Because often, when people talk about soaking something up, the default comparison is a sponge soaking up water.
Right, the sponge metaphor.
But that analogy is way too passive. It implies we're just empty, dead material, waiting to be dampened. I think a much more accurate model for what John is doing in the park is the concept of a solar battery.
Oh, okay. Explain how that shifts the dynamic.
Well, think of the human body and mind at the end of winter, not as a dry sponge, but as a solar-powered battery that has been locked in a dark drawer for 6 solid months.
Right.
The battery itself isn't broken, the hardware is completely fine. But the chemical reaction inside the battery has entirely stalled due to a lack of external input.
That makes perfect sense.
So when John goes to the park to do nothing, he isn't engaging in leisure. He is plugging the battery back into the grid. He is exposing the hardware to the specific environmental radiation required to literally restart the internal chemical reaction.
That is a vastly superior framework because it highlights the necessity of the pause. You cannot demand immediate output from a depleted battery the second you take it out of the drawer.
No, it would fail.
You have to allow time for the charge to accumulate. The sunlight isn't just a pleasant aesthetic experience, it is a vital catalyst.
It's doing real work.
Yes. It triggers the production of vitamin D, it regulates serotonin levels, and it recalibrates the circadian rhythm that was thrown off by the darkness of winter.
So the act of lying in the grass and doing nothing is actually a period of intense biological work. The body is rapidly rebuilding the physiological reserves that were drained by the cold months and the stressful process of the indoor purge we just discussed.
You have to allow that chemical reaction to stabilize before you can demand any complex output.
And the transcript respects that biological timeline. It allows for that period of passive absorption before it moves into the next phase of behavioral change.
Because once the battery is charged, the energy demands an outlet. We transition from passively existing in nature to actively manipulating it.
Which brings us to the introduction of their botanical metaphors, cultivation and pruning.
This is where the psychology gets deeply layered. Emma and John move the conversation into the garden. Emma brings up the concept of the green thumb, defining it as a natural talent for making plants grow and flourish.
And John provides a very relatable contrast. He says his mother possesses a true green thumb. She cultivates these incredibly beautiful, complex roses.
Right.
John, on the other hand, admits he cannot even keep a basic cactus alive.
Which shatters the illusion that spring is just a period of effortless, chaotic growth.
Yeah, it's not magic.
No. The sun and the fresh air provide the baseline conditions for life, but directed, meaningful growth requires active cultivation. John's mother doesn't just watch the roses. She has to understand the soil pH, she has to manage the water levels, she has to apply the right nutrients at the right time.
It takes work.
Yes, she has to apply her cognitive bandwidth to nurture the specific outcome she wants. John lacks that specific focus, so his environment fails to thrive despite the change in season.
Cultivation is a highly intentional additive process. You are actively adding value and resources to the environment to encourage life. But Emma quickly introduces a counter-concept that reveals the duality of the season. She brings up the idiom to nip something in the bud.
And she actually warns John that the phrase sounds a bit violent or negative. She defines the bud literally as the tiny nascent part of a plant that holds the potential to grow into a full flower.
Right.
If you have a green thumb, your entire goal is to protect that bud so it can bloom. But if you nip it in the bud, you are taking a pair of shears and deliberately decapitating the plant before it can grow.
It is an act of localized destruction.
Exactly.
And John immediately translates this botanical violence into a behavioral framework. He understands that metaphorically, it means identifying a problem or a negative situation in its absolute infancy and destroying it before it has the chance to develop into a full-blown crisis.
And his example is highly relevant. He mentions realizing that his screen time was creeping up. He was checking his phone too constantly.
Well, been there.
Right. But instead of waiting until he was spending 4 hours a day scrolling, he recognized the inception of the bad habit and set a hard screen time limit. He nipped the behavioral bud.
Which brings us to the central tension of human growth, perfectly mirrored in these two idioms. I mean, we often assume that personal development is a purely additive process. Learning new skills, building new habits, cultivating the roses of our lives.
But that is only half the equation.
Exactly. If John's mother indiscriminately waters her entire garden, she won't just grow roses, she will cultivate the weeds as well.
And the weeds will eventually choke out the roses because they are competing for the exact same resources.
So true growth requires an equal capacity for ruthless subtraction.
Exactly. You must possess the capacity to nurture what is valuable, while simultaneously wielding the vigilance to recognize and destroy what is harmful before it takes root. If you only cultivate, your life becomes overgrown and chaotic.
A jungle.
Right. If you only prune, your life becomes a barren patch of dirt. The green thumb of human psychology requires the continuous, exhausting balance of both forces.
You have to feed the positive habits you want to grow, and you have to aggressively nip the negative habit loops in the bud before they consume your mental bandwidth.
It is brilliant how we use the mechanics of agriculture to explain the mechanics of neuroplasticity. When John catches himself checking his phone and stops it, he is literally weakening the neural pathway of that habit loop before it can strengthen into an automatic behavior.
He is weeding his own brain.
And that internal weeding is the final prerequisite. We've cleared the physical space, we've broken the stagnant atmosphere, we've recharged our biological batteries, and we've established a system of behavioral cultivation and pruning.
Every external and foundational element has been optimized.
Yes. And this leads to the ultimate phase mapped out in the conversation, the internal renaissance.
This is where the external actions permanently alter the internal state. Emma introduces the phrase, a spring in your step, defining it as walking with a light, energetic, and cheerful cadence.
And John adds that this internal cheerfulness becomes visibly legible on the body. He uses the example of someone receiving good news and how that mental state instantly translates into physical buoyancy.
What fascinates me here is the biomechanical feedback loop. Emma notes the linguistic coincidence that the season spring shares its name with the physical action of springing upward.
It's a nice quirk of the language.
But it's not just a quirk. It's rooted in how our bodies process environmental and emotional weight. During the winter, when the environment is hostile and our cognitive load is heavy, our physical posture literally compresses.
We hunch against the cold.
Yes, we walk with heavy, conservative steps to avoid slipping on ice. We physically contract to conserve heat.
We embody the stagnation.
We do. But once the external burden is lifted, once the air is warm and our energy is restored, that physical compression releases. The biomechanic of our stride actually change. We strike the ground differently. We stand taller.
The mood dictates the posture.
Exactly. But the posture also reinforces the mood. By walking with a spring in our step, we are continuously signaling to our brain that the environment is safe, energy is abundant, and forward momentum is possible.
And that forward momentum, that deep alignment of physical buoyancy and psychological readiness, it creates the optimal conditions for the final, most profound behavioral shift in their list.
Turning over a new leaf.
Yes. John defines this as the ultimate fresh start. It is the act of consciously choosing to behave in a better, more responsible way. It's the installation of a new, positive habit.
His specific example is deciding to wake up earlier every single day to go for a morning walk.
But the most revealing part of their discussion isn't the definition of the phrase itself, it's the debate they have over the timing of it. John notes that culturally, people usually talk about turning over a new leaf on New Year's Day.
Oh, the classic New Year's resolution.
Right, but John argues that from a logical standpoint, making a massive life change makes infinitely more sense in the spring.
And behavioral psychology entirely validates his argument. Let's dissect the anatomy of a New Year's resolution. On January 1st, we make grand, sweeping declarations of behavioral change.
We demand that our brains forge entirely new neural pathways.
Right, and adopt highly disciplined routines. But we are demanding this massive expenditure of internal energy precisely when the external environment is at its most punishing.
It's the ultimate friction.
It is. You are trying to start a grueling new morning running habit when it is pitch black outside, the temperature is freezing, and your biological battery is completely depleted. You are fighting your own physiology and the physical environment simultaneously.
It is essentially an exercise in self-sabotage. You are demanding that a tree sprout a new leaf in the dead of winter. It defies the biological reality of the system.
This is exactly why the failure rate of January resolutions is so astronomically high. But when you defer that ambition to the spring, you completely alter the friction equation.
Because the environment is finally conspiring with you rather than against you.
Exactly. When John decides to start a morning walking habit in May, the friction is drastically reduced. The sun is already up, providing immediate circadian reinforcement.
The air is warm, removing the physical discomfort of the cold.
His battery is charged, providing the surplus energy required to initiate the task. He has the physical buoyancy, the spring in his step, to carry him forward. The environment isn't just passive, it is actively supporting the new behavior.
The ambition to turn over a new leaf finally aligns with the natural world's timeline of generating new leaves.
It transforms behavioral change from an agonizing test of willpower into a natural extension of the season, which is a profoundly hopeful framework to operate within.
It is the culmination of the entire psychological journey Emma and John inadvertently sketched out.
And as they wrap up their episode, they actually turn to their listeners with a direct question based on this concept. And I think it's the perfect question for us to consider as well. Think about your own current behavioral baseline. Given the fact that the environmental friction is lowering and the seasonal energy is returning, well, what is the specific new leaf you want to turn over right now?
It requires an honest audit of your own habits.
It does. And it doesn't have to be a monumental shift. It could be a massive overhaul of your daily routine, or it could be just a micro habit. But what is the one positive action you want to cultivate now that the external conditions are finally primed to support its growth?
If we look back at the overarching architecture of this discussion, the progression of these concepts is remarkably cohesive. It proves that lasting behavioral change isn't just a matter of sudden inspiration. It is a multi-stage process of environmental and psychological management.
We started by analyzing the phenomenology of disgust in our own homes, leading to the structural intervention of decluttering. We fought the evolutionary friction of discarding the past to clear our cognitive bandwidth.
We then expanded our visual field to confront the hidden decay of our environment, utilizing the surplus energy of the season to execute the deep clean and reset our baseline.
We broke the closed loop of our stagnant winter atmosphere, letting in the literal and figurative breath of fresh air to completely disrupt our entrenched routines. We then stepped outside to act as solar batteries, doing the quiet, vital biological work of recharging our physiological reserves in the sun.
Once charged, we embraced the duality of the gardener. We acknowledge that growth requires both the intentional cultivation of the green thumb to nurture the positive and the ruthless vigilance to nip negative habit loops in the bud before they can consume our resources.
And finally, all of that environmental mastery translated into a biomechanical shift. We gained a literal spring in our step, a physical buoyancy that lowered the friction required to finally turn over a new leaf, aligning our personal ambitions with the frictionless momentum of the natural world.
It is a profound behavioral roadmap, disguised as a simple list of idioms.
It really is. But before we completely close the book on this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final conceptual puzzle to examine on your own time. It builds directly on the botanical metaphors Emma and John provided, but looks at the longer timeline of those metaphors.
We've focused heavily on the inception of growth, right? The bud and the new leaf.
Right. The transcript highlights the optimism of turning over a new leaf, and how the act of practicing these changes makes them stick. But let's look at the actual life cycle of the metaphor we are using. We celebrate the new leaf in the spring. It unfurls, it captures the sunlight, it looks vibrant, it thrives through the summer.
But the biological reality of a leaf is inherently temporary.
Yes, regardless of how well it grows, when the environment shifts again, when the cold returns, that leaf will inevitably lose its color, detach from the branch, wither, and die on the ground.
It is a closed, inescapable loop. The leaf is not permanent.
Exactly. The tree will stand bare through the winter, only to be forced to generate an entirely new leaf the following spring to replace the one it lost. So if we apply this timeline to our own psychology, it forces a rather confronting question. Is the act of turning over a new leaf, these spring resolutions, these moments of waking up early and optimizing our lives, are they just temporary seasonal highs?
Oh, wow.
Are these behavioral changes simply destined to fall away and die the moment the environmental friction of winter returns? Are we just trapped in an endless Sisyphean cycle of stagnation and frantic rebirth, making the same resolutions every single May, only to abandon them every November?
That is the pessimistic reading of the cycle. But there is an alternative interpretation.
There is. What if the value isn't in the permanence of the leaf itself? What if the repetition of this cycle, the yearly, grueling practice of purging the closet, scrubbing the unseen corners, recharging the battery, and attempting to start fresh down, what if the act of continuously trying is the point?
So the repetition is the goal.
Does going through this cyclical struggle year after year eventually build a stronger internal root system? Even if the individual habit the leaf fails in the winter, does the resilient practice of always trying again ultimately forge a permanent green thumb for managing the chaos of our own lives?
That's a powerful thought.
Next time you are standing in your living room, staring with absolute disgust at that messy shelf, you have to ask yourself, are you just putting on a temporary coat of paint for the season? Or are you doing the slow, invisible work of tending a psychological garden that will outlast the winter?